Hi all, I am back with the Sewcialites quilt, and yes, I am going to attempt to finish this. If you've been following the Sewcialites quilt along, they also have a Instagram page where you can see everybody's lovely quilts as they're completing them. Some people have changed up their pattern and created different looks to it. I'm probably going to keep this pattern here. This is the original pattern, and this is the 9-inch blocks that I am doing, and it's going to finish at maybe 81.5 by 81.5 inches. I might put a border on it, I'm not sure. We'll see once I get it all sewn together. So currently, before you sew all your blocks together, you have a 9.5-inch block. So keeping that in mind, we need to make sure that we have the correct amount, size, and number for our solid background squares and our half triangle squares as well. So for these half triangle squares in this pattern and on the Sewcialites, I believe they used layered cake, so 10-inch squares layered with their background, and then I had a line drawn across diagonally and sewn on either side and then trimmed down to 9.5-inch squares for this. However, I have a solid fabric, or I bought a yard or two of one type of fabric that I'm going to use for all of these blocks. So if you're planning to do kind of an eclectic look of your patterns on those half square triangles, you're going to need 8 10-inch layer cakes, or 8 solids of whatever solid color you want to use if you're just going to use one type of fabric. So for that one, since there's 16 half-inch triangle squares, since there's 16 half triangle squares for these parts, you're going to need 8 10-inch blocks of your background and 8 of whatever you choose for your contrasting color. And so we'll do that first, and then when you count up the rest of these solid background blocks here all the way around your pattern, you're going to need 12 9.5-inch blocks. Remember, these are 10-inch because you're going to be sewing on a 1/4 inch seam allowance on that diagonal line on both sides and then trimming down to 9.5. But because these are solid squares, you just need 9.5-inch squares for your solid background. So you're going to need 12 total of those. So that should be it. I'm going to list the amount in a quick little slide before we get started on that. So this fabric that I have here is the contrasting fabric, solid fabric. Well, the pattern is not solid, as you can see, but this is going to be the other fabric that is going to be paired with my background fabric for those half triangle squares that I'm making. And as you can kind of see, it's pointing away from you, but it's kind of a directional fabric. It's got flowers and a bird perched. So basically what I might do is cut out the 10-inch squares that I need for this, and then making sure that it's facing upright towards me, then do a diagonal line to try and do a directional look to my quilt. So maybe half of those blocks will have the bird upright, and then maybe the other half will have the bird upside down. So maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of figure out what I want to denote as my top of my quilt and what's going to be the bottom of my quilt, and then have the top section have the birds upright, and then the bottom section will have the other 8 blocks with the bird upside down, kind of making this center of the block at least. So we will see how that goes, but for right now I need 8 10-inch blocks of this fabric, so I'm going to start doing that now. So I have my 8 10-inch squares for this. I've already rearranged them so that all the birds are facing the same direction. On this top piece, you may not be able to see it, but I have a little bit of that salvaged edge in my cut. But as it's definitely smaller than a 1/4 inch, so that's okay if you want to try and make sure that you have enough width-wise of your fabric. Sometimes you can, like, you know, cheat a little bit and cut some of that non-printed fabric into your block. As long as it's less than a 1/4 inch, it should be hidden by your seam as long as you're sewing a 1/4 inch. So that way you can help save a little bit of fabric, but I was pretty good. I had almost a full inch left on that other side of the fabric on that fold for wiggle room because I made a little bit of a mistake. If you want to make this go faster, you could have layered up those two pieces and cut through 4 layers of fabric, but I was like doing one at a time every once in a while just to make sure I'm not messing up, because I bought this fabric a while ago. So even though I do have extra, which is nice, and I would have been okay if I messed up, sometimes you don't have that, and it's good to just start on one piece, and then once you have that confidence that you're not going to cut the wrong size, then you can go through and layer up and save time. So now that we've got this, we can now do, I think I'm going to do my 9.5 inch blocks for my background first, just to make sure I have 12 of those. Because worst case scenario, if I don't have enough of my background fabric anymore, I can try and find more online. Or since it's pairing up with this block, you could use something that's similar to that background to contrast this block, and then it won't be so noticeable per se than using something else on that solid background block that you need. So I'm going to do my 9.5 inch blocks of my background first, and I will need 12 of those, and after that I will need 8 more 10 inch blocks for my background to match up with this fabric. So I just quickly re-ironed my background fabric, and based on the length of it as I was ironing, I am pretty sure I am going to be good for all of my blocks that I need to cut out, and we'll have extra. So I always seem to have extra, or maybe I just did really good with being frugal with my cuts for my blocks when I was making them. I don't know which, because I'm pretty sure I only got what was listed and not extra. So for this part, I'm doing the 9.5 inch blocks. I'm going to get 4 total out of each 9.5 inch strip that I cut. So if I need 12 of those, then I'm going to need 3 of these 9.5 inch strips. So I'm going to start with that first. Alright, so I have finished cutting my 9.5 inch squares, and I made 12 of those. As you can see, I layered them up at the last moment and cut through 6 layers. Luckily I have a pretty fresh titanium blade on my cutter, so that would made it a pretty easy job. If you don't have a fresh sharp blade, I would probably not cut through that many layers. So now I'm going to make my 8 10 inch blocks for my background that I need. So I finished cutting out my blocks. So I've got 8 10 inch blocks of my background fabric and 8 10 inch blocks of my contrasting fabric for my half triangle squares. And then I've got my 12 9.5 inch background squares to fill in the rest of the blanks on my quilt. So now that I have that, I can draw a diagonal line across on my background squares with the fusion pen that I have, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side with these two sandwiched together to help create my half triangle squares next. And that should make 16. Now that I've drawn my line, I am going to sandwich my contrasting and my background fabric together and pin them, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side of that line that I have drawn on them, and then cut down the middle and press an iron and trim down to 9.5 inch squares. I've sewn a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side of that diagonal line, I can cut directly on the diagonal line, press, and then trim down to 9.5 inch blocks. Alright, so I have my 16 9.5-ish inch blocks that I'm going to trim down to about 9.5 inches or as close as possible. And then once I have all those done, then we'll be pretty much ready to lay out the whole entire quilt. So catch me on that next video to see the top come together.